In this video, I'll be showing you how to add your internal blocking material that will allow you to secure your deck accessories and fin box into your hollow board. Before getting started with this step, you will need to decide what material you are using for your internal blocking and where you will be placing your deck accessories. For the material, I'm using mostly EPS foam that you can buy on Amazon or from your hardware store. If you want to build a completely foam-free board, you can also use scrap wood like you'll see me use for the handle blocking. The main benefit to using EPS foam is it's virtually weightless. For my top deck accessories, I'll be adding 4 leash plugs for my bungee system near the nose, a handle in the center, and most importantly, an air vent near the tail which allows the hollow board to breathe so as not to create a pressure gradient between the inside and the outside of the board, which would cause expansion and damage to your finished board. I'll also be installing a plastic leash loop in my solid lumber tail block in a future step, which does not require any internal blocking. And then lastly, on the bottom side of my board, I'm adding a plastic fin box. Keep in mind the location of these accessories is mostly personal preference. It's up to you to decide how your board will ultimately be used and how it will look aesthetically. Next, I'll show you how to add the blocking for each accessory, starting with the wood blocking I used for the handle screws. First, you need to find the center of gravity of your board, which is pretty close to the geometric center, but I like to just practice holding my board in my hand as I would if it were finished, and then mark the handle location that feels balanced. Now, I had some leftover leather laying around, and so I decided to test out a removable leather handle that I coated in a waterproofing wax for this build. There's a lot of different handle options out there, like plastic handles or completely recessed handles that you can also try. This one works by securing the leather handle with stainless steel machine screws into matching tapped holes in this wood blocking. To mark the location of the internal blocking, I just placed my handle on top of the frame and marked the length of the handle with a Sharpie. Next, I cut a handful of excess 1/4-inch cedar strips and glued them together and onto my frame using polyurethane glue and a couple of spring clamps, making sure that all the pieces were sticking out above the center spine. I like to make sure that my internal blocking material leaves me with plenty of room of excess in both depth and width for my accessory to be inserted, just to ensure that when I drill down I don't accidentally cut a hole into the hollow chamber. Once the polyurethane has completely dried, scrape off the excess with a chisel. Next, I used a combination of a Shinto rasp and a 120 grit sanding block to make the blocking material flush with the frame, so that the wood strips will sit perfectly over that blocking without causing any gaps. Just use your finger or a straight edge to test that the blocking is following the lines of your frame kit, spine, and ribs. The last thing to do with this handle blocking that I forgot to film is to coat that newly added wood with a little bit of epoxy and a foam brush. That way the epoxy soaks into that wood to make it a little bit more waterproof and resilient. Next, I'm adding some EPS foam blocking for my fin box. Remember, the side of your board that has the strips on it right now is the bottom side, so you're going to need to glue your blocking material snugly to the underside of those strips. I'm placing my fin box about 6 inches from the back of my board, and if you're using a standard longboard fin box like I am, there's going to be plenty of space to move your fin forward and backward within the fin box based on your riding preferences. The foam block I'm using is 12 inches long by 3 inches wide and 2 inches deep. Since this is a center fin, you will need to rip cut your foam down the center and then sandwich the center spine piece. You're also going to need to make a cross cut in your foam to fit your pieces in between the ribs. I think it's helpful to cross-cut your foam pieces a little bit proud of the distance between your ribs so that you can wedge the foam in nice and tight, which makes it so you don't really need to clamp it down at all. Using polyurethane glue and a stick, cover all sides of your foam block and push your piece snugly into position. And this is probably overkill, but once positioned, I added an extra bead of polyurethane glue around the seams to create a really tight and strong bond. For any of the foam blocking pieces that are not wedged in tight like that, you're going to need to use some clamps or even just some masking tape to hold that block into position. While my fin box blocking material is drying, I started to work on my vent. For aesthetic reasons, I like to place my vent in the center and rear of the board. The only problem with that is the center spine can kind of get in the way of your vent, so I'm using this laser cut hole that's in the center spine to my advantage and placing my vent directly over the top of it. To make sure that air can circulate freely through my board and in and out of my vent, I make a little foam bridge around that hole. Simply trace that circle and mark the center spine onto your piece of foam so that you can make the right cut with your saw. Make sure to leave your foam a little bit proud of that center spine so you can sand it flush after the glue dries. And just like the fin box, you're going to need to rip that foam piece down the center so that you can glue your foam blocks on both sides. Clamp the pieces gently but snugly together using polyurethane glue and make sure that the air hole that connects both sides remains open. In a future step, we're actually going to drill through our opened vent and into that opening so the air can flow into and out of the entire board. Once that glue is fully dried, I used 120 grit paper to sand the material flush with the spine. The last bit of foam blocking that I need to add is for my 4 leash plugs that I'm going to use for a simple X-shaped bungee cord cargo system in the front of my board. I decided that adding the leash plug anchor points to the 4th and 6th rib from the nose would both look and function really well for my design. I measured equidistant from the side rails and marked the blocking location with a Sharpie directly onto the ribs. The scrap EPS foam that I had laying around wasn't quite tall enough to stand directly onto the bottom strips, so I just used some painter's tape to glue and suspend the foam blocks in place. Again, remembering to make sure that they stick out above the ribs. And the last thing to do after that glue is cured is to use that curvature of the ribs to sand your foam so that the top strips lay across them smoothly.